How the Russian-Ukraine war is affecting Africa. Russia's war in Ukraine has disrupted Africa's promising recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic by raising food and fuel prices, disrupting trade of goods and services, tightening the fiscal space, constraining green transitions, and reducing the flow of development finance on the continent, said the United Nations Assistant Secretary General Ahuna Ezeakonwa. On May 10, 2022, a food market can be found in Douala, Cameroon, where food inflation is causing hardship due to Russia's conflict in Ukraine. Ezeakonwa, the Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa for the United Nations Development Programme, stated that the war has put households, communities and nations throughout Africa in a very hazardous situation on June 14 at the US Institute of Peace. The critical question before us today is, how can African countries and their partners leverage their abundant resources and human capabilities to address the immediate effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and advance their long-term development and security needs? Said Joseph Sani, Vice President of the Africa Center at USIP. In other words, how can Africa make the best of this extremely bad situation, he continued. The invasion of Ukraine was led by Russian President Vladimir Putin and his forces, described as one of the most aggressive military acts seen in Europe since World War II. The military invasion of Ukraine has had far more geopolitical consequences than expected. Though it is too early to know how this war will end, it is clear that we are now at a significant crossroad in international politics. Many political figures in Africa are concerned about the long-term geopolitical effects of the ongoing conflict in Europe, particularly with regard to security and political development of the continent. How the Russian-Ukraine war is affecting Africa food and fuel insecurity. Wheat imports into the African continent increased to 47 million tons between 2007 and 2019, a 68% increase. In fact, 81% of all these wheat imports came from this area, and according to projections, wheat consumption in Africa is projected to reach 76.5 million tons by 2025, of which 48.3 million tons or 63.4% is projected to be imported from outside the continent. In the meantime, Western sanctions against Russia have not only resulted in a shortage of fertilizer, which has directly affected global food security through decreased agricultural production and outputs, driving up food prices, but have also had a negative impact on the export of Russian fertilizers to other global markets, including African ones. The Russian-Ukrainian war has caused extreme price shocks and the disruption of the supply chains of various commodities across Africa, ranging from wheat and sunflower oil to crude oil, as Africa heavily depends on the import of food crops and vegetable oil from the combatants. African nations have been severely impacted by the closure of ports, such as those in the Black Sea, where the majority of trade between Russia and Africa occurs. As a result, food crop and fuel prices have increased by an unprecedented amount. In addition, after the United States and Saudi Arabia, Russia is the world's third largest crude oil exporter and the second largest military power. According to the news organization Al Jazeera English, in 2019, 48 countries purchased Russian crude oil worth $123 billion. It is not surprising that the invasion of Ukraine has had an impact on the security of the fuel supply across the world because they are a country with significant political, economic, and military clout. Oil price volatility has made it more expensive to produce food in Africa, with conflict-affected areas like the Sahel being the worst affected. Food insecurity will most likely increase the risk of long-lasting conflict in the Sahel region of North and the West of Africa. The impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war in the Sahel region of Africa. As if problems like environmental deterioration, climate change, migration, ongoing conflicts and insurgency threats weren't enough, it is likely that food insecurity will raise the likelihood of prolonged conflict in Africa and specifically in the Sahel region. Widespread malnutrition and famine result from a combination of environmental factors, including drought, extreme weather, and the Russian-Ukrainian war, which have an impact on both the production and supply of food. Increased food security, particularly in the form of rising food prices, is found to increase the likelihood of protest and armed conflict, according to the research of prior scholars Marsh and Rudolf Sen. They contend that the least developed countries, which are heavily reliant on food aid, are one of the two groups of nations most likely to be exposed to the current food insecurity. The majority of these nations are located in Africa. The Sahelian countries are particularly susceptible to these outside shocks, especially fragile states like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and a portion of northern Nigeria. As a result, it is more likely that we'll see an increase in violent conflict in this already complex region. Conflicts and insecurity are likely to spread throughout all of Africa if there are no rigid regional security frameworks in the works that can address these current and potential security threats. Government revenues impacted. Even as nations are being forced to spend money on social safety nets, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine have decreased trade and tax revenues for governments throughout Africa. Countries are being asked to spend more, with less coming in, and the sub-Saharan African countries' fiscal and monetary responses increase public obligation across Africa. In the meantime, rising borrowing costs for African nations are a result of credit rating downgrades. According to research by the UN Development Programme, biased credit ratings may be costing 6 African nations an additional $13 billion in interest payments, according to Ezeakonwa, who is the UN Development Programme's Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa, who also noted that borrowing costs in Africa are significantly higher than those in the rest of the world. Imported inflation, according to Ezeakonwa, is one of the most pernicious effects of the conflict in Ukraine. Tanzania, where overall inflation spiked by 34% between February and April. Namibia, where transportation costs increased by 20% between March and April. And Cameroon, where food prices rose from 26% between February and March, were some of the countries cited among the numerous African countries suffering due to the war. The major trading partner of Africa, Europe, is forecast to enter a downturn, according to reports on the state of the economy there. The World Bank claims that the war is to blame for growing worries about a sharp slowdown in the global economy, rising inflation and debt, and an increase in the poverty rate. Numerous channels, including the financial and commodity markets, trade and immigration relations, and the negative impact on confidence, have been affected by the economic impact. Economic repercussions from the conflict may last for years. Globally, as Europe attempts to dissuade itself from Russian oil and gas, the war has reshaped perspectives on the extractive sector, particularly on energy security and energy transition, and reignited a renewed appetite to invest in oil, gas, and coal. It is still unclear how these changes will affect Africa's energy transition, extractive industry, and economic outlook. How can Africa organize itself out of this mess, given the rising cost of living, fuel prices, and supply chain disruptions for petroleum products across the continent? The war's impact on Africa directly affects the UN's Global Goal 2, which aims to eradicate global hunger. The lack of access to grains and the increasing food and oil prices also has potential to push African citizens deeper into poverty. Not to mention, global food prices are already the highest they've been since 2011, meaning that the war can only make things worse for food security and economic stability on the continent. Is there still any hope? Despite its many difficulties, this geopolitical crisis offers a chance for African nations to become less dependent on food imports from outside sources and to develop a resilient food system that can supply the needs of the expanding population in the coming years. Natural resources such as arable land for agriculture are unendingly available to African nations. African nations could improve their position on the world stage by successfully utilizing the potential economic opportunities associated with producing food for domestic consumption and exporting the surplus. It remains to be seen though whether this vision can be realized in the real world. In the face of these challenges, a business as usual approach will not be enough. 3 areas that should be prioritized by African countries and their partners. 1. Reframe development finance and rethink the global finance architecture. In order for Africa to retain a larger portion of the value of its strategic mineral, agricultural and human resources, this must start by enhancing domestic resource mobilization. This can be done by strengthening Africa's tax efforts, increasing average tax to GDP ratios from the current 17.5% to 24%, and eliminating unnecessary tax exemptions for large corporations. Together, these steps will help reduce the nearly $90 billion in illegal tithes from the continent. 2. Consistently invest in resilience. Isiakono discussed the necessity of shock-proofing democracy and development. She said, progress without resilience is not sustainable, pointing out that development is not a linear process and that various shocks can undo gains. Initiatives that enable Africa to fully utilize its wealth in natural resources, utilize eco-friendly financing techniques, and concentrate on investing in climate risk-sensitive sectors can all help the continent become more resilient. According to Isiakono, investment in higher value-added manufacturing and exports, increased productive capacity, food and fuel security are necessary for Africa and its development partners. 3. Prioritize structural transformation and regional integration. Isiakono said Africa needs to harness digital technologies and promote free and fair competition globally, intensify support for regional integration and economic diversification, and mobilize resources to fill critical gaps in technology, skills, and infrastructure. Africa needs to be more assertive about taking its rightful place in the world. Financial and global institutions should also understand that an investment in Africa's well-being is investing in the world's well-being. What's good for Africa is good for the world. 4. Reducing reliance on imported food is a surplus. Africa must also see the current geopolitical crisis as a chance to reduce its reliance on food imports from outside the continent, even though the socio-economic ramifications are already significant and the situation is still very unpredictable. African nations must make the most of their 60% global share of arable land to increase domestic food production and exports to other countries and the world market. As a result, fewer people would experience food and nutrition insecurity as a result of external shocks. Rapid expansion in agricultural and food productivity and production has been identified as one of the game-changing solutions. To prevent future disruptions in the supply chain for wheat and sunflower across Africa, countries that produce these cereals need to increase their capacity to produce and supply to other countries through intra-African trade. And those that do not should consider incorporating specific food crops into their agriculture value chain. This will reduce the reliance on wheat and grain imports from Russia and Ukraine, and most importantly, promote intra-African trade and grow Africa's agribusiness sectors. 5. African Continental Free Trade Area, a lever and driver for intra-regional agri-food markets. The African Continental Free Trade Area, which went into effect on January 1, 2021, is another tool for changing Africa's food systems. Africa must benefit from the largest free trade zone in the world. The trade agreement is anticipated to result in a combined GDP of $2.5 trillion, and agribusiness will play a significant role in this expansion. In order to supply and expand local and regional agri-food markets, the African Continental Free Trade Area will increase production and value addition and ensure adequate quality infrastructure and food safety standards. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're here for your first time. Before you watch the next video, please leave us the answer to this question in the comments below. Is it true that this is an opportunity for Africa's oil and gas producers, or is this just an illusion which may soon disappear? Let us hear your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to share with your friends.